The city pulsed with restless energy. Engines roared, tires screeched against asphalt, and hurried voices blurred into a chaotic symphony of impatience. Street vendors shouted their last sales of the evening, and a distant saxophone played a tune that was neither joyful nor sorrowful. It simply drifted, lost in the commotion. Among the blur of movement, amidst the faceless crowd that rushed forward without pause, a lone figure stood still. He was frail, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face turned toward the street yet unfocused. His white cane rested against his palm, tapping once, twice, then still. He didn't move. He simply waited. People brushed past him without a second glance, as if he were just another fixture of the city. A statue, a shadow, an inconvenience. Some glanced at him briefly, before turning away, uninterested, unaffected. But not her. Evelyn, 17, with a quiet gaze that saw what others ignored. She had been on her way home, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her mind drifting between the events of her day and the warm meal that awaited her. Then she saw him. A pulse of unease stirred in her chest. He looked out of place, not just lost, but expectant. She hesitated, glancing up at the crosswalk signal. The light flickered. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Everyone else walked past. No one stopped. No one cared. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't noticed him, keep moving like everyone else. But she didn't. She stepped forward. "Sir, do you need help crossing?" Her voice was soft but steady, carrying just enough warmth to not startle him. Slowly, he turned his head toward her. His face, lined with years of untold stories, cracked into a faint smile. Not one of relief, not one of surprise, one of recognition. Finally," he murmured. The breath hitched in her throat. Finally! How did he know someone would come? She swallowed the strange prickle of doubt that crawled along her skin. Maybe he had been standing here for a long time. Maybe he had asked others for help before her. Maybe. But something about the way he said it, soft, sure, expectant, unsettled her. She should have walked away. She should have ignored the feeling creeping up her spine. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded, extending her arm. "Come on, I'll help you." His fingers, cool against her skin, wrapped around her wrist. And the moment they touched, the world around her seemed to shift. The honking, the footsteps, the murmurs of strangers, all of it dulled, as if just for a moment. They were the only two people in the world. The moment Evelyn stepped forward, guiding him off the curb, the air seemed to thicken. Her grip on his arm was steady, yet a strange unease crept through her. It wasn't the act of helping him that made her tense. It was something else, something unseen, a feeling, like a whisper at the back of her mind, telling her that this moment was different. The old man's fingers, though weathered with time, held a certain steadiness, not desperate, not frail, just firm enough to remind her that he wasn't as helpless as he seemed. "Thank you, dear child." His voice carried a weight beyond mere gratitude. It was knowing, measured, unsettling. Most would rather pretend I don't exist. Her breath hitched. He was right. She had watched dozens of people walk past him, as though he were invisible. She had almost done the same. But why? Why had she been the only one to stop? The thought unsettled her. The city's noise stretched, distorting into something unnatural. The once sharp honking of impatient drivers blurred into distant echoes. The voices of pedestrians grew muffled, their movements sluggish, like figures trapped behind frosted glass. Evelyn blinked. The air pressed against her skin, thick and expectant. A sharp flicker of the traffic light overhead sent a pulse of unease through her spine. She glanced up just in time to see it glitch, green, yellow, red, flickering between colors too quickly, as though something were tampering with time itself. The blind man's hand tightened around hers. "You're not like the others." His words were barely above a whisper. A chill crawled up her neck. She looked at him, really looked at him. His face, lined with stories she would never know, remained unreadable. His lips barely moved, yet his words clung to her skin like a secret meant only for her. How could he tell? She wanted to ask. She wanted to pull away, but the moment she considered letting go, something in his grip shifted, not threatening, not forceful, but intentional. She was meant to be here. A gust of wind cut between them, sharp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold. It was late spring. The air had been warm just minutes ago. But now, it carried a biting edge that sent a shudder through her bones. Halfway across the street, Evelyn's heart picked up pace. She could feel it now. They weren't alone. Her head turned, scanning the blurred cityscape. Buildings loomed taller than they should have. The distant street lamps flickered, stretching their shadows unnaturally long. There, across the street, just beyond the next sidewalk, stood a figure, still, watching. A man, dressed in a long, dark coat, hands buried deep in his pockets, face obscured beneath the brim of a hat. Evelyn's steps faltered. Her fingers twitched in the old man's grip. He noticed. "Don't stop," the blind man murmured. Her throat dried. "Who is that?" she asked before she could stop herself. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as though he had been expecting the question. "The one who follows," he finally said. Evelyn's chest tightened. A car sped past them, wind whipping against her hair, breaking the moment. She turned her head back to the figure, gone. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. This was wrong. Everything about this moment felt wrong. The other side of the street was just steps away, but the space between stretched impossibly far. Like they had been walking in place. The old man must have sensed her hesitation. His grip on her arm steadied, grounding her, as if anchoring her in reality. "You see them, don't you?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of something ancient. Evelyn swallowed. "Them?" A small smile touched the corner of his lips. "The ones no one else does." Her fingers grew cold. "The ones no one else does." She wanted to laugh it off, call it nonsense, tell herself she had imagined it. But she knew better. She had always known. As a child, she had seen shadows move when there was nothing there. Faces and reflections that weren't her own. Whispers in places where silence should have lived. She had learned to ignore them. She had convinced herself it wasn't real. But this old man, he knew. The sidewalk was close now. Just a few more steps. The weight of the air grew heavier, pressing against her lungs. Then, the street lamp above them blew out. Darkness crashed over them like a wave. Evelyn sucked in a sharp breath, her heart leaping into her throat. For a split second, the city was silent. No honking. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. Then, a whisper. Close. Too close. Not from the old man. From something else. Something standing just behind her. Her skin prickled, every nerve screaming at her to run. But she couldn't. Her feet felt nailed to the pavement. She didn't turn around. She didn't dare. The blind man, however, remained calm, unshaken. His head tilted slightly as if listening. Then, in a voice so low it barely carried over the hush of the city, he said, "Not yet." The whisper behind her stopped. The air shifted. The street lamp flickered back to life. Sound rushed back in like a flood, horns blaring, footsteps shuffling, voices talking. The city was alive again. They were standing on the other side of the street. Evelyn's breath came ragged, her pulse erratic. She turned her head sharply, scanning behind her. Nothing. The street was normal again. People walked, cars moved. Life continued. Had it even happened? Her gaze darted to the old man, but he had already released her arm. The warmth of his touch lingered. "You're different," he said simply. "That is why I chose you." Chose her? Evelyn's mouth was dry. She didn't know what to say, what to ask, what to believe. But she knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning. Evelyn's heart was still hammering against her ribs when the old man came to an abrupt stop. The moment his grip left her arm, a chill seeped into her skin, as if something unseen had retreated along with his touch. The city's noises had returned. The hum of engines, the distant chatter, the occasional ring of a bicycle bell. Yet, standing here on the other side of the street, everything felt different. She turned toward him, trying to steady her breath. The blind man faced her, though his sightless eyes did not waver. It was as if he were seeing her in ways that required no vision at all. "You've done something remarkable today," he said. His voice held no embellishment, no grand weight. It was simple, certain. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his coat. Evelyn's muscles tensed, her pulse drumming in her ears. From the deep folds of his weathered garment, he retrieved something small, no larger than the palm of his hand. A wooden box, intricately carved, its surface bore delicate etchings of symbols she did not recognize. The edges were smooth with age, yet the latch, old and rusted, looked as though it had not been opened for years. She stared at it. Something about it felt wrong, not in the way that made her recoil, but in the way that made the air grow thick, as though the space between them had shifted, ever so slightly. Evelyn swallowed. "What is this?" the old man chuckled, a low, knowing sound that crawled beneath her skin. "A gift," he murmured, "but only if you're brave enough to open it." A strange tightness gripped her chest. The box sat there, resting in his outstretched hands, unmoving, and yet something about it felt as if it were breathing. She should refuse. She should step back, shake her head, and walk away. But she didn't. Her fingers twitched at her sides. There was something about the way he spoke, so assured, so final, that made the world around them seem to shrink. The air between them stretched, bending under the weight of a choice she didn't remember agreeing to. Her breath shallowed. She reached forward. The tips of her fingers barely brushed against the wood when a whisper, not from him, not from the city, from the box. She snatched her hand back. The old man's smile deepened, as though he had expected that. Evelyn's throat tightened. "What's inside?" He didn't answer, didn't even move. Just stood there, holding it out, waiting, a gift, a curse, a choice. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had to know. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out again. This time, she didn't pull away. The air around Evelyn thickened, pressing against her skin, as though the very atmosphere had weight. The rusted latch of the box let out a reluctant click, a sound too sharp in the silence that had wrapped around them like an unseen force. The lid creaked open. Her breath hitched. Nothing. The inside of the box was empty. She stared, her brow furrowing in confusion. A sharp disappointment coiled in her stomach. This was it. This was the great mystery. The gift he had spoken of. Evelyn glanced up at the old man, expecting some kind of explanation. But his expression remained unreadable, a knowing smile, a patience that unsettled her more than his silence. The wooden box felt impossibly light in her hands. She turned it slightly, tilting it under the dim streetlights, searching for something, anything, that made this worth the strange unease tightening around her ribs. Nothing. Just as she was about to shut it, the old man leaned forward. "Look again," he whispered. His voice, so soft, yet so certain, sent a shiver crawling up her spine. She swallowed hard, hesitating, but Something deep inside her urged her to obey. She looked down. The warmth started in her fingertips. Subtle at first, then blooming like a quiet fire, curling up her arms, spreading through her chest. Then, her vision blurred. Number not blurred, shifted. The world around her flickered, colors stretching and twisting as though she were being pulled through layers of something unseen. And then, she was no longer standing on the street. She was somewhere else. Cold droplets pounded against the pavement, against rooftops, against the trembling frame of a little boy, no older than 6, standing beneath a broken street lamp. His tiny arms hugged his chest, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. He was alone, abandoned. No one stopped. No one noticed. Just like they hadn't noticed the old man before Evelyn had. She tried to move, to reach for him, to say something. But she wasn't there. Not really. She could feel the rain, taste the dampness in the air, but her feet weren't on the ground. She was inside the moment, yet apart from it, watching through a lens she didn't understand. A heavy-set man stepped out of a nearby doorway, pulling a cigarette from his pocket. He spotted the boy but said nothing. He turned away. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Then, just as the boy lifted his tear-streaked face, the vision shifted. The scent of damp wood and old leather filled the air. A woman sat on a weathered bench, her hands wringing a folded piece of paper, as though the inked words had the power to change. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, her gaze darting to the clock overhead. She was waiting. But for whom? A train roared past, its wheels screeching against metal tracks. The woman flinched, but didn't move. Seconds stretched into minutes. She checked the paper again. A note. The writing smudged. Evelyn tried to read it, but just as the words sharpened into focus, the vision pulled her away. Wind howled through the steel beams. The man's knuckles were white against the railing, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. His shoes edged forward, toes peeking over the drop. The river below was black, endless. A single step. That's all it would take. Evelyn felt her own pulse hammering in her ears. He was going to do it. Her breath came short and panicked. She wasn't really here. She couldn't stop him. She wasn't. A hand landed on the man's shoulder. Not hers. Someone else. A stranger. A single sentence was spoken, too soft for Evelyn to hear. But whatever was said, it was enough. The man stepped back. The vision shattered. Evelyn gasped. Her body jerked as if she had been yanked from a great distance, her knees almost buckling beneath her. She was back. The old man stood before her, his face calm, unreadable. The box still rested in her hands, but it was no longer warm, no longer pulsing with unseen energy. The streetlights flickered overhead, the city's sounds slowly filtering back in, grounding her into the present. Her breath was ragged. Her hands shook. What was that? Her voice barely scraped out. The old man tilted his head slightly. Memories. She swallowed hard. Whose? A pause, then. Yours. Theirs. The ones you were meant to see. The weight of his words pressed against her chest. She couldn't breathe. I don't understand, she whispered. He smiled, but there was something infinitely tired in the way it touched his lips. A gift, his voice softened. A curse. Evelyn's grip tightened around the wooden box. A choice. The words hung between them, heavier than the night air. She had seen them, felt them. And now, she couldn't unsee them. Her mind screamed for logic, for reason. But deep down, she knew. Some things couldn't be explained, only understood. What had she just unlocked? Evelyn blinked. The old man was gone. A second ago, he had been standing there, his face unreadable, his words lingering in the air like a fading echo. But now, nothing. The sidewalk stretched out empty before her, the hum of the city settling back into its familiar rhythm. A passing car splashed through a puddle, its tires hissing against the pavement. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, uncertain shadows. She turned in a slow circle, searching the crowd, scanning the street. He couldn't have just disappeared. Yet, he had. Her fingers curled around the wooden box. It was weightless now. The air around her felt different, charged, expectant, like the world itself had shifted on its axis. Had any of it been real? She looked down at the box. The intricate carvings remained. The latch still rusted. Yet, something within it had changed. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. She exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding and started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because she was tired, not because she was afraid, because she could see, not in the way she had before. No, this was different. She saw the man hunched near the bus stop, his hands wringing a worn-out hat, his eyes darting to each passing car, as though he were waiting for someone who might never arrive. She saw the woman sitting on the park bench, shoulders curled inward, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice quiet and strained, as though she were holding back something fragile. She saw the boy, no older than 10, dragging his feet as he walked beside his mother, his eyes hollow, his small hands gripping his backpack straps like a lifeline. She saw them, all of them, their pain, their fears, their silent battles. Had they always been there? Had she simply never noticed? Evelyn's steps slowed. A question formed in the back of her mind, heavy and unshakable. What was she supposed to do now? She had a choice. She could pretend, like before, pretend she didn't see, didn't know, didn't feel. She could push it down, let the world blur back into indifference. Or she could do something, help, act, give. Because sometimes the greatest gifts weren't the ones placed in our hands. They were the ones we chose to give away. She tightened her grip on the box, her fingers brushing over the carvings one last time before she slipped it into her bag. The wind stirred. A whisper, soft, barely there, brushed against the edge of her hearing. Remember. Her breath hitched. She turned sharply, eyes scanning the empty sidewalk. The air was still. The night was ordinary. And yet, a shadow just beyond the glow of the street lamp lingered, watching. Then, it was gone. Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. She let out a slow breath, steadied her shoulders, and kept walking. For the first time, she truly saw the world, and she would never be the same again. Evelyn walked, the city's hum fading behind her, yet the weight of what had happened pressed down heavier than before. She clutched the wooden box in her hands, her mind racing. Had it really been real? Had he been real? The old man had disappeared without a trace. And yet, she could still feel the phantom warmth of his touch lingering on her arm. The wooden box felt almost empty now. But was it? A gust of wind swept through the quiet street, rustling the leaves on the pavement. It sent a familiar whisper curling through the air. Remember. Her heart thumped. She slowed her steps, standing beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. The night stretched around her, quiet, expectant. With hesitant fingers, she lifted the latch once more. A soft glow, barely there, like a dying ember, illuminated the inside. At first, it seemed empty. But then, as the light pulsed, something appeared at the bottom. A mirror. Small. Fragile. Its frame lined with carvings too intricate to be coincidence. Evelyn swallowed, lifting it carefully. It was colder than the air, colder than anything she had ever held before. She turned it slowly, angling it toward her face. Her breath caught. The reflection staring back at her wasn't hers. Or rather it was, but different. Her eyes, darker, wiser. Holding a weight they shouldn't, a version of herself that had seen things, known things. It was like looking at a future she had yet to live. a self she had yet to become. And then, the mirror flickered. The image shifted. 1,000 reflections flashed before her, faces she did not recognize but somehow knew. A mother weeping in silence. A boy staring at an empty dinner plate. A man gripping his chest in a hospital room, waiting for news he already feared. The pain, the suffering. And then, beneath all of it, hope. A small child's hand reaching for another. A stranger stopping on a street corner. A woman offering the last coin in her pocket. Moments. Choices. Evelyn gasped, nearly dropping the mirror as the images stopped. The glow faded, leaving only her own reflection once more. Normal, ordinary, yet changed. Her fingers curled around the frame. The old man's voice echoed in her mind. A gift, a curse, a choice. Her pulse slowed. She understood now.
The box had never been about what was inside. It was about what she would do with what it had shown her. She had a choice. To ignore it, to pretend she hadn't seen, to walk through life like everyone else, untouched, unmoved, or to act, to help, to change. Because sometimes the greatest gifts weren't the ones placed in our hands. They were the ones we chose to give. Evelyn inhaled deeply, shutting the box with a quiet click. She looked around one last time. No sign of the old man, no whisper in the air. But somehow, she knew. He was watching. Somewhere. Waiting. For what? She wasn't sure. But she would find out. She slipped the box back into her bag and turned down the road. The night stretched before her, long and unknown. But she wasn't afraid. She was ready. If this story moved you, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Rare Tales Unfold. Subscribing is completely free, and it helps bring more stories like this to you. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, stay curious.